This is the Grow Your Clinic podcast from Clinic Mastery. We help progressive health professionals to lead inspired teams, transform client experiences, and build clinics for good. Now, it's time to grow your clinic.
Well, welcome back to another episode of the Grow Your Clinic podcast. You might be tuning in on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or you might be watching this video on our Facebook group, the Grow Your Clinic Facebook group, wherever you're joining us. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to bring you another episode, as we always are. We love our little relationship and community we've got with our podcast listeners. And today we have another guest joining us. I'm super excited to introduce you to Damien Adler, who is the co-founder of Power Diary, which is a practice management software we'll hear all about. But Damien's a fascinating guy and can't wait to have him as a guest on the show. Damien, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Jack.
How's your day going today, mate? What have you been up to today?
Fantastic day. I'm actually ticked off a lot of goals. I'm slightly ahead of my to-do list today, which is always a wonderful position to be in. So
it is, yeah, absolutely, on a Friday afternoon, and this will be published after the fact. But you're a Victorian. We won't hold that against you. But who's going to win the grand final this weekend?
Well, I'm going to have to go with the Victorian team here. So,
of course,
I couldn't do anything other than that. So I think they'll come home strong. As to whether that's the way it plays out, who knows? I would imagine you might be perhaps barracking for a different team there, Jack.
Oh, look, it's funny, Damien. I'm a Swans fan, and so I detest the GWS Giants. Mm-hmm. So hopefully recording this now after the fact, when it gets published, the Giants have been demolished, because the last thing I want to see is them to win a flag. So there you go. Welcome to the podcast. We're super excited to have you on here. We'll get into the nuts and bolts of Power Diary a little bit here, and your philosophy when it comes to healthcare practice, and also your personal story, which I think is fascinating. But before we do, a couple of quick rapid fire questions to open up the conversation. Firstly, what is Damien working on right now?
Well, right now, in fact, when I left to come and talk to you, there were two things I've been working on today. We are launching a new online forms function to allow patient data and research and patient outcomes data to be sent out to people. So I was working on that. The other thing that I have going and open on my desktop is a new series of videos explaining different elements of Power Diary. So we've recently gone through a brand refresh, and we have updated our colours and our look, and it's been part also of an updated UI. So we're over a period of time, we've been updating each area of the UI. But what that means, of course, is that the videos that we normally use to educate people suddenly show a somewhat outdated UI, and this job has been needed doing for a little while. But now that we have that out and we have our bright, fresh colours, then it is time. So I've been looking through and looking at which ones are most in demand, and writing out all the key points to hit. So hopefully by the time this is published, they will be out and ready for people to see.
It's funny, isn't it? It speaks to so much. I'm sure there's clinic owners that could sympathise. And I know we even had a case where we haven't refreshed and updated our welcome packs for a couple of months, and that we've got new therapists on the team that haven't made it into the welcome pack yet, because you just don't often think about some of those resources that are evergreen until they're not.
That's right. And sometimes it can sneak up on you too, can't it? Where you look at something and there's been a change that everyone seems to be across, until you realise there's some content out there that really doesn't quite match your current look, and might actually look a little bit dated, dare I say. So it's always exciting to get to flow it through and have everything up to date and looking nice.
Yeah, super. Okay, what are you reading currently?
I'm actually revisiting a book, E-Myth, which is...
of course.
Yeah. So as you can imagine, E-Myth, I have read it before, of course, but I thought it's a good one to go back to in practices, because I think it makes such a big difference to the way in which practices operate and the way in which they work. There are actually a few books that I'll revisit like that, and this is one. So it's one that I'm currently working on. And if anyone hasn't read this yet, I would certainly recommend it, because it is amazing, very powerful.
Totally agree. E-Myth by Michael Gilbert. We'll actually link that up in the show notes so that people can grab that link if they want to head straight over to Amazon and get that. Awesome. So what are you working on? What are you reading? Who do you look to for inspiration or mentorship, Damien?
Really look fairly broadly, and it's from different areas of, I guess, where we aim to sort of be leaders in a particular area. I'll look to what is best practice in that area and try and I guess garner or get as much sort of insight and wisdom. And sometimes it's almost cross-pollination. So it might be a business that's really not related to practice management or to Power Diary in particular, but some of the concepts are. So for instance, when we're looking at support and how to help customers be successful, I'd look at industries and other software providers where I think that they've got that absolutely nailed, or they do something that is different or delivers better value, or importantly, breaks technology down to be accessible and usable. So I'll often look at whoever seems to be really doing well, and there's evidence to suggest, okay, this software practice is known to provide amazing support. And then I'll do a deep dive and try and pull it apart and deconstruct it and understand what all the elements are that do that. So it often comes from a pretty wide variety of things, and often completely unrelated industries, because sometimes if you look at just, say, in the software space or just in the health space, there sometimes can be, there's ideas that are floating around, but nothing that's new or takes it to that next level. And so that's kind of where I tend to go. So I could be reading pretty much anything.
I love it. And there's so much value in getting external perspectives or learning from other industries. We often look to technology like Apple or Virgin or some of those bigger brands. How can we implement those into clinical practice? So that's awesome, mate. Thank you for sharing. All right, let's dive into a little bit of your story and then your philosophy to empowered health practices. But firstly, who is Damien Adler and why should we listen to and trust you? What's your background, mate?
Well, you'll have to decide at the end of our talk whether to listen and trust. I hope that you come away and think, well, there's something of benefit there that that has been offered. But listen, the background really, it's been a very natural development into the software space. And I did not in any way start out with the intention of being in the space that we're in. So I'm a Australian psychologist in a nutshell. So originally did my training, became a psychologist, and worked in the public health system for some time, in the public mental health system. And then my wife, who's also a psychologist, and I decided that we would like to start a private practice. And this is going way back 2007, roughly, right, in that ballpark. And that led us to, of course, like a lot of practices starting out, looking for practice management software. And at that stage, there were mainly on-premises software available. So that meant we had to install it, you had to have servers and infrastructure and everything, very expensive. But we were also looking at the emergence of cloud-based systems, which were very new. And we tried actually a few different systems, both on-premise and originally a cloud-based system, and just didn't like it. It was clunky and not very useful. And so we eventually ended up using a system that was called Pencil Me In. So it was where they had the right idea. We thought they had some basics really down pat, but they just weren't developing it. So we started using it and thought they're close, but they just weren't investing back into it. There were features weren't coming out. It seemed stagnant. And it was a shame because we could see how powerful it could be. And what we ended up doing is negotiating to actually purchase that code base and that company. And it was tiny. But my brother partnered with my brother because I've got the health background, but was not originally have a technology background. My brother Paul had a technology company, big company in Australia, and it had been purchased by Telstra. So Telstra just finished the acquisition of his company. And so I went to him and said, hey, you've got the technology brains and know-how, and I've got this health background. And so we partnered up and we bought the code base. We then actually ended up rebuilding everything from scratch, because when we looked at it, we thought, okay, the concepts, there's some good concepts. So then we actually rebuilt Power Diary from scratch, and the rest has just developed from there. So we had originally very few customers using the system, and it's just growing and growing and growing. And we constantly getting feedback in terms of what people would like to see implemented, and away we went. So the approach that we took was really, the underpinning idea was that the system should be central to the operation of a practice. And in our own psychology practice, it started out with my wife and I, and we wanted to get to a point where we as the principals, as psychologists, weren't the primary income generators. But we realized the only way that could happen is to have a system that was scalable and that would allow things like, for instance, remote reception services, because we were very small, we didn't have the money, or we weren't busy enough to have a full-time receptionist sitting there, but at the same time, we wanted the phones answered. So that all led us to this idea that it needs to be cloud-based, scalable, access from anywhere, but of course, secure and reliable. And so then once we were able to grow Power Diary and grow the clinic at the same time, then as Power Diary grew, of course, I stepped out of the clinical role in the clinic, and my wife continues to run that to this day, and it's going really well. But it's been this very personal journey, really.
I can imagine.
Yeah, as it's developed.
That's fascinating. I can only imagine the dinner time discussions between a husband and wife psychologist, but we won't tackle that today.
There might be a whole separate discussion around the.
I don't think we've got enough time to go there. But look, kudos to you. As our listeners know, that running a healthcare clinic is a feat in itself, let alone starting and sustaining a technology company on the side, which has now probably taken over.
Absolutely.
Is quite a challenge. And I guess that puts you in that unique position now of being on both sides of the fence, so to speak, having running your own practice, but also seeing the data and the trends and the habits of clinic owners. Am I right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's given us a unique sort of perspective on what's happening, and often helped, I think, us translate the needs that might be expressed by our users and the outcomes that they're trying to achieve and the pain points that they have, and being able to translate that in a very real way to say, okay, I actually know what that is like in a practice, and being able to hear the different stories that people tell us, and then be able to think, what are the central things here that we could do that is going to alleviate this and allow the practice to be more successful. And having that insight, sometimes it's a funny thing because it's very subtle, and it can be some of the smallest things that make the biggest difference. So we have a very active feedback loop from our users. Each week, we in fact review every piece of feedback that we've received. And you can imagine, with a user base of over 27,000 users, that's a lot of feedback. But we do it on purpose so that we're always listening to what that is, understanding that and filtering that through to a technology, from a technology perspective, and deciding how do we then achieve that. And so it's been fantastic. And often, to this day, I'll jump on the phone and want to speak to our users directly and to understand the need that they've got, and more importantly, the impact that that's going to make to their business and the direction that they are heading.
That's awesome, mate. Really, really cool to hear that. So I want to then dive into, you've developed this philosophy or framework, formula, if you will, around empowered health practices. But to start off with, I'd be really interested. What does an empowered health practice mean to you?
Empowered health practice, the way that we sort of view it is that they are in control of their practice. They're able to do the things with the practice that are important to them, both from a commercial point of view, of course, but also from a values-driven perspective, so that they are able to deliver services, grow in the way that they want, and be able for the practice, in a sense, to be an extension of them, but in a way that the practice doesn't own them or consume them. And what we know, and I'm sure this is, similar to your experience, that the people in the healthcare sector, lovely people who have very good values are in the industry because they want to provide a service of value, and they want to provide better health outcomes ultimately for the population. And so when we think about empowered health practitioners and empowered practices, we're thinking about what sort of things lead someone to feel like they can, I guess, achieve that vision or achieve that purpose and feel day to day that idea that they're making a difference. As much as that can sound a bit corny, at the end of the day, that's the reality of, when you think about the value of our time and the value of what we do with our life, making a difference is where it all, comes back to. And so for us, in very simple terms, that's actually how we see an empowered practice and empowered operations.
So good. Thank you for sharing. And it really resonates, I'm sure. It resonates with me, I'm sure, with our listeners around that making a difference. And we've recently launched our Clinics for Good approach. And, that we don't get into healthcare just to, make the millions. And we get into it to make a difference. We get it to build a clinic for good. So that really resonates. And we're going to unpack now your 6-factor formula, or the 6 components to an empowered health practice. And as I think about these and have reflected on them prior to this recording, that it really sits closely to our 7 degrees of clinic mastery. So let's see where we end up here. This will be fun. Let's unpack them. So
absolutely. So
I've got them in front of me here. Yes. We're going to talk about strong finances, client outcomes, robust processes, growth, work-life balance, and minimal admin. Can you unpack? Let's start. Where would you like to start?
I think I'd like to start with the great clinical outcomes, because at the heart, unless we have that ticked off, then nothing else is going to matter, right? Because whether it's from a professional satisfaction point of view, or whether it's about just the way the practice will grow, we need to be providing great clinical outcomes. And so these 6 things are things that we use to shape and influence every decision that we make about Power Diary and what we develop. So great clinical outcomes means having the right tools and the right information available for people to provide the services that they want to provide, to be able to engage clients in the treatment. And there's some interesting research, showing that one of the biggest risks of treatment not being effective actually isn't substandard treatment; it's disengagement.
Right.
And so, which seems really, obvious when we think about it, but in fact, we don't necessarily pay enough attention to it from a clinical outcomes point of view. We might focus on it from a commercial point of view, and that's important, but from a clinical outcomes point of view, we need people engaged. So we build tools in Power Diary to sort of allow that. So we have, for instance, about a year ago, we launched 2-way live SMS chat that people can have with their clients, because what we found is that some clients, they might, for instance, miss an appointment, then be reluctant to contact the practice or find it confronting. And so what we found is that if they actually sent a personalized live, SMS to say, hey, just checking in on you, that was less confronting. They wouldn't screen a call and so forth, would be able to sort of re-engage. To be able to just make sure that, say, for instance, with our note system and the redevelopment of that we did about 18 months ago, the focus was on making sure that all the relevant clinical information was available right there. People could scroll through and see lots of notes. They could hover over and see images and see everything pop up without needing to download it or go searching through folders, have it all nicely laid out. And that all kind of ties into this idea that to get great clinical outcomes, that information needs to be available and it needs to be, just ultimately easy to use.
It's so good. And, most of what you've touched on there isn't clinical per se. It's the non-clinical element that helps to drive great outcomes. They go hand in hand. And I think some of those things you've touched on probably flows nicely through to robust processes. Considering experiences is one thing, but being able to processify those experiences is really important. So talk to me about robust processes.
So robust processes means that we've got a nice, clear and systematic way of actually achieving things. When I say achieving things, I mean going about the normal day-to-day business of running a health practice. Because if there is a system in place to operate the practice, what tends to happen is that it relies on individuals doing things in a particular way and remembering to do that. And that information will often sit with maybe the principal or the practice manager, or it might even vary between individual practitioners. So having robust processes means that there's a standardized way of doing things, that there is a routine to it, and there is safeguards in place to pick up if something hasn't occurred. So if notes, for instance, haven't been written for a session, then in Power Diary that is a visible, people can actually see that hasn't occurred. Or if an appointment hasn't been checked out or hasn't been processed or the payment hasn't been obtained, then it doesn't rely on people remembering that individually. The system actually determines that or illustrates that this needs attention. So the idea is to take all the different facets of running a private practice and build them into a system that does a lot of the work for you. And means that when that happens, you also have a significant reduction in the amount of administration that you need to do. And it means that, it has a cost benefit, but also it means the whole thing runs more smoothly.
I love it. Let's skip around the circle if we can, as you've segued to it. Why is minimal admin important to an empowered health practice?
The way that we, if we look at health practices, you have, like any business, you have income and you have outgoings, right? Now, administration is an outgoing. There's no two ways about it. It is directly offsets any income that has been generated by the clinical activities that are being performed. So the more that we can reduce administration, we get an immediate boost to productivity and an immediate boost to profitability as well. The second thing is that when we reduce administration, usually everyone wins, right? Because when administration is reduced, it typically is due to there being systems and processes in place that are easy to use
Right.
and are simple. So it's sometimes like when we're helping practices move to powered RA, so they might be using lots of individual systems to migrate. So they might have something that produces invoices, something that's managing appointments, something else that are keeping their notes. When we actually say, okay, let's transfer all of those things into the system and get a central source of truth. Here is the system, and have a lot of those things automated, their level of extra work they have to do significantly reduced. There was one practice that we had, and they're a moderate-sized practice, and they had 2 full-time EFT admin. So they had 2 full-time reception staff. At the time that we started working with them, they were looking to employ a 3rd person. When we actually started and we had a number of conversations with them before they moved across to us, we looked at it and said, well, look, let's just hold off on this extra recruitment because you might be surprised once we actually transferred, and we do a lot of data importing when people are onboarding with us. So it's part of a service that we offer to make it easier for people to get on board. And so we were importing their data and getting them all set up. And then all of a sudden they were saying, oh, yeah, okay, we can see that the admin is reducing. After it was about probably 4 or 5 months, they had actually reduced their admin right down. And I think the last time we spoke, they had something like 8 of an admin persons still, but in fact, they had actually grown. So they had more clinicians and they had much less admin than they've ever had in their life. And what they used a bunch of things there that the system offers to try and, to reduce that. So they were using, credit card processing that's integrated, using the client portal so people could book their own appointments and doing things like that. They're invoicing, click the button and email it off rather than print it out and so forth. But it's amazing and super rewarding when you see, this makes a tangible difference. And it's funny, even talking to the owners, they almost, you can just hear it in their voice. They're just more relaxed now than what they were, prior. I'm sure you've seen it in the work that you do when you transition, when you're working with clients from point A to point B, and you see when they arrive at that and everything is running well. It's a different experience, isn't it?
It really is. It really is. And I love that. I think sometimes clinic owners can hear minimal admin and they think we're either, from a practitioner perspective, trying to increase their billable hours, or from a reception perspective, we're trying to, take away someone's job with technology or outsourcing. I don't think that's the intention here. What we're trying to do is empower health clinics so that perhaps those reception team are able to create better client experiences for those patients who are waiting in the welcome room. Or from a clinician perspective, the less admin they have to do, the more they can see patients and create amazing experiences and outcomes. And I know that's a real wrestle for, those professions like speech pathology or sometimes psychology, OT, that the admin becomes so overbearing. If we can minimize that using tech, you create an empowered health clinic. I love it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to your point about reducing the admin team, what we've found a lot of practices end up doing too is they'll actually repurpose some of their administration resources.
So good.
Yeah, and that's, like you said, they might even be putting together fact sheets and patient resources and whole lots of other things that providing better value, for patients ultimately, but also it allows the clinic to grow in different types of ways rather than just having to scale up admin, often at a disproportionately high rate to the growth, because doubling in growth can sometimes mean, without a good system in place, that you've got 3 times the mess,
Absolutely.
because that's the way, it gets more complicated. So when they get a system in place, and seeing people utilize those resources in different ways is fascinating. And some have even had their former reception staff go off and do like diplomas in marketing or diplomas in communication, and then with that are able to utilize those skills. So it doesn't necessarily mean just, okay, we're now cutting hours, actually able to do something that delivers more value than chunking through a ineffective or a slow process.
Yeah, love it. So we've covered positive client outcomes, robust processes, and minimal admin. There's 3 other factors to an empowered health clinic. So run me through the next one.
I wanted to talk about financially being well rewarded.
Okay.
And for what people do. And I think this is something that is a vulnerability for health practitioners, because we ultimately get into the game to provide services and help people. But that can also mean that practitioners end up doing lots of things that don't result in a good in for themselves. And the way that we see it is that, for most health professions, there's a lot of study to get there, a lot of training. It is a job that involves a lot of, obviously human interaction, which, while is wonderful, can also be taxing. In addition, the responsibility that goes with that and operating a practice and complying with all the relevant laws, there's a whole lot of stuff that sits with the practitioner. And we think that health, it shouldn't be any different, right, to any other profession, that where you need a lot of qualifications, there's a lot of responsibility, and what you do is super important and delivers a lot of value. We have this crazy notion that you should get paid well for that, right?
Crazy, so I know, right?
I know, but it's right out there, isn't it, Jack? But really, it's amazing how often that is not something that the practitioner has been able to achieve, or they're achieving a good financial outcome, but the input is too high. So they might be working really high hours, billing enormous amounts of time because they feel that they have to meet the client demand, and they're getting a decent income. But in fact, what they're trading is their time and their health and their well-being and their enjoyment of what they're doing. So whenever we are implementing new features or designing something, this is a key question that we think about, is how do we help practices be more financially successful? And so that can be things like integrating with a payment platform, so that if people can take a payment at the time of bookings, a patient goes online, books an appointment, they can set it so that the patient pays at that time. So immediately improves cash flow, and it means that the attendance rate, of course, is much higher if someone has prepaid. So little things like that we're always looking to do, to say, how do we make it easier for businesses to get the rewards that they deserve? And we have a feature that I haven't publicly mentioned before, but we are releasing a type of debt collection system where people can email out overdue accounts and have a very seamless process for people to pay those online, and have it in a very kind of frictionless, friendly kind of way, so it can be zapped out in an SMS or in an email going out to anyone that's got outstanding accounts. So that, again, automates it, doesn't require someone sitting there necessarily phoning everyone or sending out overdue notices. So everything we think about is, does this contribute to the bottom line for the practice owner and help them get a better reward for their work and their sacrifice?
I love it. And people swing one way or the other when it comes to finances. We shy away from it and pretend it doesn't exist and wonder why it breaks eventually.
Yes.
Or we get so focused and obsessed. At the end of the day, it's a reflection of value provided. Yes. Yeah. And if we can help hundreds or thousands of patients who are looking for our care, then it's okay to be remunerated appropriately. And I think that also touches then, Damien, on work-life balance. Talk to us about how that factors into an empowered health clinic.
And this might be something that people perhaps don't expect from a practice management system, but one of our focuses is around people living a passionate life and being able to spend their time on the things that they are passionate about, which may have nothing at all to do with their work. It could be, yeah, it could be, but it doesn't have to be. Very often they have, and we think actually it's quite healthy to have a nice broad range of interests.
Yeah.
And so we think that empowered health in a practice, it's where people have the time, but also the mental resources to be able to do the things that they feel strongly about. And that could be, just hanging out with their kids and going off hiking or going out, camping. We have some, practices who they'll send us photos of what they're doing, with the Power Diary, but they'll be on the other side of the world, on a 3-month trip, and they're running a large private practice back in Australia or somewhere, and they'll send a selfie, saying, here's me, responding to something on Power Diary, or doing something to do with an appointment, or sending out invoices. I think because people know this is something that we value, that people have this capacity to run successful businesses and successful health practices, but have time for other things. Writing books is another one that's quite common. Often, we'll find health practices or health practitioners have got a lot of experience, and they know that they've got something that they can offer at a larger scale than the individual client care that they provide, and know that a book would be a wonderful thing, and something that really captures their knowledge and allows other people to access it, but they don't have the time, or they don't have the sort of mental resources because they're feeling a bit frazzled. And so we really view those things as important and central. And again, when we're developing things, we're thinking about how does this help people be able to have the mental space? Is this going to make things simpler or more complicated? And if it's going to make it more complicated, then let's find another way to do it. If it's going to making a change that is going to, take more time, like we literally count clicks, like when we make a change, how long does it take to perform this action? How many clicks? Because all of that adds up and takes away from people's time to do and to spend with the people they care about, or if it's professionally focused, that's great. But then at least they're doing something that they really feel good about and will reflect on and feel proud of.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. And then the final one is growth. So I'm happy for you to touch on this, but I know there might be some. Now, we're on a podcast called Grow Your Clinic. Yes. But I know there are some people that are not growth mindset or growth focused. So why is growth important to empowerment?
Yes, I think it's a good point that you make, that around growth, we view growth in a broad way. So we think of course, the traditional growth, which is where you might want to grow in terms of grow the size of the practice and grow the amount of clinicians and amount of services that are being provided. But growth can also mean other things. It can be about growing the range of services that a practice or a practitioner is able to offer. It may be growing in terms of being able to work less and earn more, even if it's an individual practitioner in a solo practice. For us, we would view that still as growth. If they're able to grow their income and their profitability, but not necessarily want to grow their practice, because perhaps they maybe have 5 years left until they want to retire, and their way of looking at it, they would rather grow. They would rather sort of see those years out. We would sort of help them in the way that we conceptualize to say, what does growth mean for them? And that might mean, okay, well, if I can grow revenue in a different way, or be able to be more efficient in how my practice operates, that will give me time to do these other things, to launch the workshop I've always wanted to do, or to write the book, or to do something else. So we think about growth in very different sorts of ways. It doesn't necessarily mean, often it does, but it doesn't necessarily mean just growing in terms of the number of hours being billed out of the practice, or the number of clinicians that are on board.
It's a good distinction. And I think also, there's no such thing as stagnation, right? You're either growing or you're dying.
Yeah, exactly.
It's very difficult to maintain the status quo. And so I think having that growth mindset or approach to empowerment makes a lot of sense, if for nothing else, to avoid a slow death.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the fact that you said that, because something that it always goes through my mind is the idea is that if you think you're sitting still, you're actually going backwards, right?
Right, that's true.
Yeah, you just it's exactly right. There's this natural sort of atrophy of anything. And so we need to be growing, and we even know from going now back to my psychology origins, but we know that the brain needs it. We need difference, and we need to be constantly learning, and our brain never loses the capacity to do that. And it's much happier and healthier brain when we are challenging ourselves and growing in whatever format that might mean or is valuable to that person.
That's awesome. And so I'd say on a practical level, the challenge for the listener would be around where do you want to grow? And your mind might go straight to the dollars or the number of consults or those things that are easily measured. Perhaps the challenge is how can you grow in your leadership capacity to facilitate your team's growth? I know that often clinic owners transition to that ownership perspective, and maybe you've quote unquote, made it or found some financial stability for your life. How can you create pathways and empower others? That's where you become an empowered health clinic, which I really love, Damien. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's very aligned. I think in the things I've heard you talk about over the time too on your podcast, that approach that very much runs through the work that you do, which is fantastic.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. And that's awesome. So that's wrapped up the 6 factors there to an empowered health practice. For listeners, if we were to review on them, it's positive client outcomes, robust processes, minimal admin, strong finances, work-life balance, and growth. So Damien, that's so good. And I love that Power Diary is not just looking at helping people manage their practice, but helping people, practice management software is what you do, but really why you do it is to create empowerment for clinic owners, which is unreal. So if people wanted to get in touch with Power Diary yourself, or learn more about what it is that you do and if it's a good fit for them, where should they head to?
Yes, if they can go to our website, so it's powerdiary.com, and there's lots of information there about the way that we approach practice management software and the way in which we approach the health industry. And so people can have a look at there. Of course, we have all our features and all the different things that Power Diary can do and outline the ways in which they can help. But beyond that, we have information just to see to go on there and see whether that connects and resonates with you. And that's what we typically find is that people kind of get it. And I think it's one of the reasons that Power Diary has grown so much over the years, even though we actually don't do a lot of overt marketing, has been this sort of word of mouth, and that people say, I kind of get where these guys, where they're coming from and what they're doing here, which just warms the heart and is something that really is a driving force for us. So it's start with the website. Any questions? Of course, we've got a wonderful customer success team that are there to help with anything. We can organize free demos and onboarding or data import. So whatever we can do that helps you make a transition or improve what you're doing, then do let us know. And the team are right there ready to help.
So good. So good. And listeners, we'll link all that up. We'll link up powerdiary.com over at the show notes, which you can find at clinicmastery.com/podcast. Look for the episode with Damien. We will have all of those links there and in and around the socials as this episode is published. Damien, we are about to wrap it up. Do you have any final words of wisdom, funny jokes, or final parting comments for our listeners?
I think parting 2 points quick way is that if you don't have a system, get a system in place that runs your practice. Of course, I would hope that it's Power Diary, but a system, right? That really helps, because I think that makes such a big difference to how a health practice operates. And I think the second thing is remember to have fun and enjoy the journey. We're providing, as health practitioners, great services out there. You're making a difference. Enjoy the ride and really, take as much from it as you can on a personal level to recognise the contribution that you're making. So have fun with it.
That's awesome. You're a legend. We really appreciate your time, and I'm sure the listeners have too. If you've loved this episode, why don't you head over to wherever you've listened to this podcast and leave us a review or rating, or you can get in touch with me personally, jack@clinicmastery.com, and let me know what you thought of our conversation with Damien Adler from Power Diary. But thank you for joining us, Damien. Thank you for joining us, listeners, and we can't wait to bring you another episode again really soon. Bye for now.
Thanks for tuning in to the Grow Your Clinic podcast. To find out more about past episodes or how we can help you, head to www.clinicmastery.com/podcast. And please remember to rate and review us on your podcast player of choice. See you on the next episode.